Hello everybody, this is Syntax. Before we get started on the story today, I would like to let you know that this is a requested extension on a story previously done. If you have not heard the story before or wish to recap it, please follow the link in the description below before you start this one. Thank you. And now, on to the story. After bonding with my mount, known as a human, or as they call it, Dr. Williams, it has become a bit easier to be accepted. They fed her a bit too well, which made her a bit self-conscious once again after I had adjusted her, absorbed a bunch of nutrients. She did not like, as she put it, gaining weight. At this point, I do not see an issue with that. Would it not be healthy to have a base layer of this? After a few planetary rotations that they called days of our initial briefing, I was able to go outside for the first time and see the starlight, what those humans call sunlight. It was so bright and so warm. Even with my head still tucked in due to the bonding, I could feel it. I could not only feel it on myself, I could feel it on my wings, and I could feel it through my mount as well. Such an odd thing, as we usually cannot feel this through our mounts. I did not understand why, but she needed permission to do the following, and she eventually spread my wings, and I'm still getting used to the sensation of being controlled instead of being the one in control. However, it is not so difficult, and to my surprise, it seemed as though my wings had actually got larger as they spread out wide. I told the humans, and they immediately began to rush over and measure my wings, checking them against all previous measurements, and they confirmed that my wings had gotten larger, much larger, by over 10%. Dr. Williams was thinking it had to do with the bonding with the human above others, and still insisted on attempting flight. I never ever tried this with one of my mounts. Yes, we did alter ourselves depending on which mount, but usually our mounts were very robust, and, well, let's just say our wings would not pick them up. If anything, it would annoy the mount a little bit. Getting wings up to speed took a few seconds, as neither of us were used to spreading wings this large. Once up to speed, Dr. Williams seemed to take a strange pose, as though she was trying to be photographed or something, as though an invisible force would grab her, lift her up, and bring her forward. Looking into her thoughts, she had a strange idea of flight that would actually quickly crash us both. As she went to step forward, I screamed, "Not that way!" into her head, and I showed her the position she would have to be in if we were even going to attempt this. As we left the ground, I was surprised. It worked. Dr. Williams, I could feel she was happy that we could fly. A bit upset she couldn't make a show of it as she wanted. However, that suddenly changed to a strange feeling I was unaccustomed to called embarrassment, as she reminded me she was wearing something they called a skirt. I did not understand this embarrassment thing and why she kept moving herself, but I still had to constantly remind her not to cross her legs, as this would completely ruin our flight pattern. Once we reached significant enough height, Dr. Williams felt something else. She felt free, a sense of freedom, elation, almost like the wonder of a child as she looked over everything. The wings were allowing her to see things in ways that humans could only do so with mechanical devices, but now the only sound up here was the sound of the wings. Sometimes not even that, as she seemed to do this thing called gliding. At least she attempted to. These wings are not designed for that. No, we are not an avian species. No, not at all. We all simply flap our wings slightly. In truth, most of our wings are only to drop down on the prey to try and camouflage us when we are, well, waiting for our mounts to arrive, and that is all. All these sensations continued for a long time. I enjoyed the taste of it all. It was wonderful. Oh, so much so that I almost forgot to keep the wings going, but then again, I didn't have to. She was now subconsciously moving the wings in ways that made us move this way and that, in ways that everyone on the ground was cheering for, yelling and screaming, taking all sorts of images and video of us. I had realized what these were a long time ago, as they had taken so many of me and even showed me what they were. Not to mention, I could read them inside Dr. Williams' head. This was such a wonderful feeling, and unfortunately it all ended in fear as we had to land. I was so exhausted that my wings almost stopped before we reached the surface. We came in, and unfortunately we stumbled to the ground and we fell. I could feel the pain as we landed. It wasn't so hard. However, many simply ran up to see if Dr. Williams was all right. However, Dr. Williams was still elated. Even though in pain, she laughed and laughed as though she had just experienced something that she had dreamed of since she was simply a hatchling. Once on the surface, the other humans did rush in to assist with water and food, as both myself and Dr. Williams were completely and utterly spent. My mount consumed them quickly, and it reached me relatively quickly, as human biology is incredibly efficient compared to others. After this test flight, there were, of course, more interviews. There was more flights and measurements, even more interviews. So many asked the same questions over and over again that I offered to bond with them just to answer their questions. Most of these questions were over and over again about the history of my species, biomes of planets my species have reached and taken and are currently from, and of course, current and former species that we have mounted, their locations of planets, dangerous and harmful flora and fauna, all this over and over again. The list just continued. Thankfully, I didn't have to sit there and speak over and over again. No, they were able to bring a device that aided not only myself, but the humans as well. This device was once used to record dreams, something I did not know of until Dr. Williams, went into their hibernation cycle. And then not only could she dream, but in some way she could control the way these dreams were. It was strange. Yet this turned out to be a good thing, since the bonding integrated with the area of the human brain that is in charge of these dreams. It worked. Though there was some trial and error, of course, eventually they were able to calibrate the device so they could see and record what I witnessed. This allowed them to get full video, in some cases full holographic images of what they wanted. Saying this sped things up was vastly an understatement. After one such interview, which was very long, as our genetic memories are quite vast, very robust, I received a shock. As we left the interview chamber, I saw the same container I was carried in when I was brought into the facility. Dr. Williams was on a flight when I motioned, and we moved in to investigate. To both our shocks, they retrieved another of my species. I did not recognize this one, but the color and design of the wings told me they must have come from the Argo sector. I figured this one would argue, would fight, would do something to the humans when they opened the container, but the one they took out looked very weak. They, of course, gave it some water, and it looked up to see me, although to do this I did have to tell Dr. Williams to turn so I could see with my own eyes. Untucking my head from the protective carapace, I confirmed it was one of my species. And through Dr. Williams, I told them that it had to be bonded soon. When they asked, "How soon?" I told them, Do not wait. Do not wait another moment." They did wait, of course, but that was for another host, as they called it, to be chosen. Seeing the eyes inside this new arrival starting to turn white, I yelled through the doctor's voice, "Time is up!" Another human, a male that they called a security guard, that had been watching Dr. Williams and I fly, simply yelled something I had heard before. "Fuck it!" With this, he took off his protective coverings, the metal shell, the cloth underneath, everything as fast as he could, and he moved over to the other one as many of the doctors placed it on his back. After the other one began to lick the human's sweet scent, it began to realize it had a moment, and only a moment, to survive, and it grasped on violently. This is to be expected, as this young one was absolutely starving at this point. I tucked back down as I did not want to be around in case something happened, but through the doctor's eyes, I watched the security guard double over as the pincers inserted themselves and the appendages wrapped around him tight, so tight that they almost broke through the outer epidermal layer. This is usually a painless process, done while the host is asleep, although one usually isn't on the brink of death when this happens due to starvation. This was an act of desperation, and they didn't have time to be nice. The security guard, as he was on the floor, was lifted by others and placed on the table with one of my species on top. As the process continued on, they monitored. Everyone there was told to leave, as only a few stayed inside the room, all of them completely covered in a mechanical shell to make sure that they were protected in case something, as they say, goes wrong. It was only a few minutes before the guard was awake. Moving around, he demanded water, and then food, and then, of course, more water. He had far less body fat than my own mount had, yet it seemed as though his robust physicality worked in his favor. In less than a single human minute after getting all that food and water into his system, one could see what was happening. This security guard seemed to be having a conversation with the one that was mounting him. At first, Dr. William and I were concerned that the two might not be compatible and they may be at odds with each other. That was until we saw the security guard laugh, and laugh hard. The security guard continued to laugh and joke and seemed to have that strange predatory grin on their face, showing their teeth, which is usually something we run from, but in this case, it was a positive experience. It seemed as though they were carrying on for quite a while, and then the security guard turned and looked over at my mount. A few moments later, there was a sudden motion as though the male had been hit by some sort of electrical charge. Those in suits were quickly able to set him on the large table. From there, they separated, and in just a few moments, the man seemed to be without a care. He was not in pain anymore, but the other, well, Dr. Williams and I were allowed in, and I was able to speak, if you can call it that, with this one. We do not vocalize like humans, but instead move our antennae in ways, and we also send out certain chemical components. With this, I asked, as soon as I was able to extend enough to put my antennae up, what went wrong with the bonding? It responded, "Nothing. I just finished fixing a virus that was hidden somewhere inside his nervous system as we were conversing. I mentioned you, we turned and he looked at you and your mount, and he began thinking about the two of you flying, as he continued saying how attractive you looked when flying. Something went wrong. There was a sudden burst. There was a rush of a strong emotion. This was a carnal desire, and we know about that. I've never felt anything this strange. I couldn't stop it. The more I tried, the more it hurt, so I had to detach. At least for now, I hope. I realized that Dr. Williams was listening and now looking at the security guard who, since he couldn't understand the language, was just standing there trying to figure out what was going on. The same thing was happening to me, but it wasn't a burst. It was a much slower build-up. I asked my brethren if it was doing better health-wise. It agreed, of course, and now it had eaten something so rich and so dense that it was feeling wonderful. After hearing this, I turned over, took control of my mount's cords, and I asked the security guard if he could keep his intrusive thoughts contained. At first, he didn't understand what was going, so I had to explain, and after explaining the situation, the bonding commenced again. This time, much, much slower, and as the security guard said, completely painless. This is the way it is supposed to go when you're, well, not starving for anything, and you can bond correctly. For several more days, there were interrogations, as they say, interviews, but mainly on the other one. The only area of interest that made the humans hesitate was when they asked why I referred to the other one as I do. They asked, "Why do you not say male or female?" I was confused at this, but then I had to read my mount's thoughts before I could answer. But when I did, I simply said, "We do not have males or females." I was oddly concerned as the humans asked about something so mundane as conception. Dr. Williams actually has to remind me that humans are not designed like us, and I had to remind myself, as I had been attached to this mount for so long, I started to forget. To make everyone calm themselves, she informs them it's not a big deal to them. They simply push their ends together, the ends of their abdomens, and exchange fluids that way. I've looked into their memories, and there's no pleasure. This is just a mechanical thing that they do when they actually choose to have offspring. Basically, once they attach, if they're taking fluids, it feels like drinking water, like a whole big glass of water when you're dehydrated. And if you're sending DNA protein strands, well, for lack of a better term, it's like taking a big healthy shit. As I simply waited for the response as she explained everything, I realized there was something they had mentioned before. It was called professionalism. Well, at least that's what humans called it. However, this concept seemed to vacate the entire room as she spoke. I only know this because they all started to simply break out in what they call a hearty laugh, all of them to include one of them falling off his seat in laughter. It had been 10 planetary rotations since the others' bonding, but even after 10 planetary rotations, the other ones did not grow large enough wings to fly, though the wings were larger, to be sure, and more powerful than mine. There is a distinct difference in the mass between the two and the mass that needs to be lifted. Though the human male now has complete control and can move the wings under its own will, for now the wings are, well, just decorative, as they are not going to be functional. Even though this human could not fly as we could, there were clearly other bonuses to the bonding that were apparent in his physicality as well as beyond his peers. This was apparent at the point of breaking the endoskeleton of another human's arm as they performed a test of strength they call arm wrestling. This human clearly had a look on his face that I did not understand. Thankfully, I could see through my own mount that he felt bad about this at first. However, he did ask for additional upgrades. 14 planetary rotations after the incident where the security guard fractured the arm. I still don't understand that. That word means something else to us. Both mounts were being brought in to be checked on their physicality, as many changes had been taking place over this time, things that, well, as we understand, are subconscious for humans and us. We didn't understand it, but it seems that the increase to their physicality is almost too much. As they are both standing there, waiting for their checkup, they both begin to take off outer layers, although they cannot wear much because of where we are located. I can feel my mount begin to lose control at the sight of the topless security guard, though she herself is not exactly in a lot of cloth. She still looks him up and down, and the more she does, she seems to be more drawn in to the amount of muscle tone that he has. We usually pull on something they call fat reserves. This meant that his muscles seemed to be more defined, yet it seems as though, with the mount there, he decides to build his muscles even more. It seems also to my mount that this security guard has also gained in height a little bit. Perhaps he is simply, as they say, standing taller, but even I can't tell a difference. She moves her eyes up and down to see a completely hairless body, not just on the torso, but also the extended arms and legs. The only hair is an extremely thick head of hair on top. There's nothing even on his face, though this is common for humans as they do something called shaving. But on top of that, the one thing that seems to pull her in above everything else is the smell. Using her olfactory senses, I can tell that his smell is quite pleasant. With this slowly creeping in, I was beginning to have difficulty holding on. Severe difficulty, in fact. And I seemed to not be the only one. I could see the other one of my kind almost starting to flinch as though it was getting too much, as both the mounts started to look at each other and began to look each other up and down slowly. I started to feel more difficulty holding on as the two mounts were suddenly demanding to leave the examination area. The doctors that were there did not want them to leave, but without permission, they went back to my mount's quarters, as she put it, because they're closer. She simply said this as she grabbed the security guard by the arm and they both ran down the hallway. Upon arriving, I voiced my concerns as I was starting to have a lot of difficulty holding on. Dr. Williams, who had gone through her own type of transformation through my help, with no need for corrective lenses anymore. Her skin was absolutely clear as I made sure those blemishes all fell off. I had eaten so much of her body fat that only 4% remained. She also had denser muscle, although I don't know how I helped there. Her long, flowing hair did protect me a little bit as it went over, and I didn't mind, as it was quite warm, as dense as it was. However, she insisted that there be hair absolutely nowhere else. She told us both, me and my other species mate, to hold on, at least as best we can. As she said, "We're going to let you experience something awesome." Dr. Williams was not lying, not one bit. The rush of hormones that came through my system. I could feel the pleasure of friction, the release of fluids, the rhythmic motion, the sheer desire and passion of it all culminating in feelings that defied explanation as my mount received a substantial amount of protein strands to the point where she ended up being dehydrated from this encounter. I couldn't believe I held on so much as they moved around, trying desperately to not crush us as they kept moving into different positions over and over and over again, keeping going to the point of, I believe, exhaustion, but then kept going again. Eventually, it ended. As the humans slept, I wanted to converse with the other, so I simply raised my head out and it did the same. However, we did not get the chance to say anything. We both began to go into chrysalis. That is what we call it. Our bodies begin to secrete fluids from every single joint we have, fluids that are incredibly, as the humans call, sticky at first, which is why we climbed to opposite corners of the room, went in and held ourselves to it. The fluid would hold us in place like a very solid adhesive. This fluid would partially harden as our wings would wrap around us, though not very tight. There was a lot of room inside. I'd never done a chrysalis before, obviously, but I knew there needed to be room. Every time there was a chrysalis, there was always movement inside, and of course we would flinch and move around during this time. We weren't sure if this was going to be a good thing or a bad thing. The chrysalis chambers, when completed, would be mostly made up of our wings, as they would be kind of a soft pod, like what the humans call a cocoon, that would stay around us until we are done with our chrysalis. When this process first began, both of us were scared. I could smell it in the air, sense it with my antennae. Not only was I scared, but the other was scared as well. This is because, on our home planet, most of us would not survive the chrysalis. Reason being is the chrysalis eater was out there, always hunting, and it was absolutely relentless, always stopping those from going through said chrysalis. Though we could reproduce without going through, if one could survive said chrysalis, you never know what was going to happen. Yet, we could relax here, because there was no chrysalis eater anywhere around here, and we could finally simply go into this own chrysalis and relax, be calm. Yet one could calm the body from knowing that it would not be consumed during this process. One could not calm the mind. Once this wrap was around me and fully sealed, my mind could only wonder two things as I suddenly felt very, very sleepy. Why? Why would this happen now, of all times? And also, what will I become? Hello everybody, this is Syntax. Thank you so much for joining me on part 2 of this requested series. Before I go, I need to send out some special thank yous to a few of my supporters, and those will be MTF Guard, Erica Gem, Guardian Sage, Brian Kemp, Douglas Scarborough, SS Demon, Prozac and Pancakes, and Sir. Thank you all so much for supporting the channel. Everybody else, I'll see you on the next one. This is Syntax, ejecting.